Okay, we're here with Mark DiCamillo, who's the director of the field poll in California. And we just completed a panel about Prop 8 and the polls done there. So I wanted to ask, first of all, the question that the panelists all answered. The last poll from just about every organization had Prop 8 failing. It ended up passing, which ended the right to gay marriage in California. What happened between the last poll and Election Day?
Well, all the polls were showing the race getting closer. In fact, our poll had it at one point prior to the launch of the Yes Side ad campaign. The No side had a 17-point advantage in California. That diminished over the last 6 weeks to where our final poll had it only 5 points ahead. So if you just plotted it on a map or on a chart, it was converging. So it was going to be a close outcome. It ended up 52-48 on the yes side. My own interpretation of why that is that I believe, and I think we saw this in the 2000 election, which was on the same issue in California that banned same-sex marriage, we see an expansion in the vote of certain religious denominations after the Sunday before the election, and it's very hard to measure that effect. And I would call it, a religious effect for the Sunday before the Tuesday election, where they can get their congregations to think a little more. And I'm not saying that they're changing wholesale opinions, but people who are on the fence, who are in conflict, I think that influence of the Sunday, the social influence, the influence of children and religiosity, I think it has an effect. And again, in the 2000 election, our final polls were showing Prop 22 comfortably ahead, 14 points or so.
What was Prop
This was
2?
banning
22.
same-sex marriage the first time around, and it passed by 21 points. So even though our poll was clearly correct, it was going to pass, we understated the size of the yes vote. And I don't believe it's a Harvey Milk effect.
Right.
I believe it's a Sunday before the election, because you can see it changing when you compare our final poll to the post-election surveys among only certain segments of the population. In this case, it was the Catholics. In this case, it was the nonpartisans and the Latinos and the African Americans moving toward the yes side in the final weekend.
Okay. In your presentation, you made a case for essentially a long-term generational replacement that is increasing support for the notion of gay marriage in California. I wonder if you could just talk
Sure.
a little bit about that data and whether you think there's the potential for, what is the potential for that trend to increase in the near term?
Right. Well, one of the advantages that the field poll has is that we have a time series on the same question over a greater than 30-year period. And so you can actually track people as they age over time, not the same individuals, but you can see the 18 to 29-year-olds in their attitudes on same-sex marriage, for example, in 1977, are very closely corresponding to the attitudes of those who are aged 30 to 39 in the mid-80s, and those very closely correlated to the attitudes of those 40 to 49 in the mid-90s, and that would be my interpretation of generational replacement. As somebody kind of ages through the population on this issue, they take with them the attitudes they held as a younger person. And so as the population of younger people back in 1977 has aged, they brought with them this greater tolerance and acceptance for same-sex marriage. So the oldest segment, 65 and over, remains solidly opposed.
Right.
But it would be my contention that eventually will be replaced by those who are in the 50 to 59-year-old category now.
Do you think that process will happen fast enough that we might see a revote that would be successful? And just generally, what would your advice be to the proponents about
Well,
timing?
I think eventually it will replace, and the yes, or the people who are advocating same-sex marriage will be in the majority and can withstand a very intensive campaign. I think campaign effects were very powerful in this election, and the yes side ran a somewhat better campaign and were able to kind of pull this come-from-behind victory. But I think in the future, the no campaigns will be able to withstand that. But I would be cautious about advising advocates for same-sex marriage to choose wisely which election they put the ballot measure on. If they decide to put it on a primary, or even maybe a gubernatorial election cycle, the turnout levels are much lower, and usually the lower the turnout levels, the greater the skew toward older voters, and that's where their support is weakest. So you really want to stage an election, if you want to have an initiative that will allow same-sex marriage, on the broadest possible turnout, like a presidential election. They had that going for them this time. Barely lost, but I think if they waited 4 years, I think they might stand a good chance to win. But I think if they jump the gun and put it on the very next election, which would be either a special election next year or a primary election in 2010, I think they have a chance of losing a second time, which could do them more harm.
Okay, great. Thank you. Mark?